Hey, Valley Bulldog, this is Mr. Mason. Hope everybody is doing all right. Welcome to this edition of Bulldog Bedtime. I got to read to you all back in the fall one of my favorite books, The Dog Poop Initiative. This time I'll actually be reading another one of my favorite books. Let me turn to that. This is actually the John Battle soccer team we're looking at. All right. This is called Enemy Pie. It is by Derek Munson. It's illustrated by Tara Callahan King. And on the pie there it says, "For my best enemy." And it's a picture of it. This is Enemy Pie by Derek Munson, illustrated by Tara Callahan King. Right. It should have been the perfect summer. My dad helped me build a treehouse in our backyard. My sister was at camp for 3 whole weeks, and I was on the best baseball team in town. It should have been a perfect summer, but it wasn't. It was all good until Jeremy Ross moved into the neighborhood, right next door to my best friend Stanley. I did not like Jeremy Ross. He laughed at me when he struck me out in the baseball game. He had a party on his trampoline, and I wasn't even invited, but my best friend Stanley was. Jeremy Ross was the only person on my enemy list. I never even had an enemy list till he moved into the neighborhood, but as soon as he came along, I needed one. I hung it up on my treehouse where Jeremy Ross was not allowed to go. Here you can see the boy, which they didn't really say his name, but he was hanging up beside his enemy number one, Jeremy Ross. Dad understood stuff like enemies. He told me that when he was my age, he had enemies too, but he knew of a way to get rid of them. I asked him to tell me how. Tell you how? I'll show you how, he said. He pulled a really old recipe book off the kitchen shelf. Inside there was a worn-out scrap of paper with faded writing. Dad held it up and squinted at it. Enemy pie, he said, satisfied. You may be wondering what exactly is in enemy pie, and I was wondering too. But Dad said the recipe was so secret he couldn't even tell me. I decided it must be magic, so I begged him to tell me something, anything. I'll tell you this, he said. Enemy pie is the fastest known way to get rid of your enemies. Now, of course, this got my mind working. What kind of things, disgusting things, would I put into a pie for an enemy? And think about what some things you might put into a pie for an enemy. I brought Dad some weeds from the garden, but he just shook his head no. I brought him some earthworms and rocks, but he said we didn't need them. I gave him the gum I'd been chewing on all morning, but he just gave it right back to me. So I went outside to play. I shot baskets until the ball got stuck on the roof. I threw a boomerang that never came back, and all the while I listened to the sounds of Dad chopping, stirring, blending the ingredients of enemy pie. This could be a great summer, after all. Enemy pie was going to be awful. I tried to imagine how horrible it must smell, or worse yet, what it would look like. But when I was in the backyard looking for ladybugs, I smelled something really, really, really good. And as far as I could tell, it was coming from our kitchen. So I was a bit confused. I went and asked Dad what was wrong. Enemy pie shouldn't smell this good. But Dad was so smart. Son, if enemy pie smelled bad, your enemies would never eat it, he said. I could tell he'd made enemy pie before. It's a good point. So the buzzer rang, and Dad put on the oven mitts and pulled the pie out of the oven. It looked like a plain old pie. Looked good enough to eat. I was catching on. But still, I wasn't exactly sure how this enemy pie would work. What did it do to my enemies? Maybe it made their hair fall out. Maybe it made their breath stinky. Maybe it made bullies cry. I asked Dad, but he was no help. He wouldn't tell me a thing. But while the pie cooled, he filled me in on my job. He talked quietly. There's one part of enemy pie that I can't do. In order for it to work, you need to spend the day with your enemy. Even worse, you have to be nice to him. It's not easy, but that's the only way the enemy pie can work. Now, are you sure you want to go through with this? Of course I was. It sounded horrible. It was scary, but it was worth a try. All I had to do is spend one day, just one day, with Jeremy Ross. He'd be out of my hair for the rest of my life. It was worth it. I rode my bike to his house, and I knocked on his door. Jeremy opened the door. He seemed surprised. He stood on the other side of the screen door and looked at me, waiting for me to say something. I was nervous. Can you play? I asked. He looked confused. I'll go ask him, Mom. He came back with his shoes in his hand. His mom walked around the corner to say hello. You boys stay out of trouble, she said, smiling. We rode bikes for a while and played on the trampoline. Then we made some water balloons. We threw them at the neighborhood girls, but we missed. Jeremy's mom even made us some lunch, and after lunch we went to my house. It was strange, but I was kind of having fun with my enemy. He almost seemed nice. But of course, I couldn't tell my dad this. He'd worked so hard to make this pie, this enemy pie. Jeremy Ross liked my basketball hoop. He even wished he had a basketball hoop, but they didn't have room for one. So I let him even win a game, just to be nice. So can you imagine letting someone you didn't like beat you in a game of basketball? That's what happened. Jeremy Ross knew how to throw a boomerang. He threw it and it came right back to him. I threw it and it just went over my house into the backyard. When we climbed over the fence to find it, the first thing that Jeremy noticed was my treehouse. Do you remember what was in the treehouse that he hung up the nail and paper? My treehouse was my treehouse. I was the boss. If my sister wanted in, I didn't have to let her. My dad wanted in, and I didn't have to let him. And if Jeremy wanted in, can we go in? He asked. Oh, I knew he was going to ask me that. But he was the top person. In fact, the only person on my enemy list. And enemies, they're not allowed in my treehouse. But he did teach me to throw a boomerang, and he did have me over for lunch, and he did even let me play on his trampoline. He wasn't being a very good enemy. Okay, I said, but hold on. I wonder what he's going to do. I climbed up ahead of him quickly and tore the enemy list off the wall. I had a checkerboard and some cards in the treehouse, and we played games until my dad called us down for dinner. We pretended we didn't hear him, and when he came out to get us, we tried to hide from him, but somehow he found us. Sure, they're even getting along playing checkers together. Dad made us macaroni and cheese for dinner, my favorite. It was Jeremy's favorite, too. Maybe Jeremy Ross wasn't so bad at all. I was beginning to think that maybe we should forget about the enemy pie. But sure enough, after dinner, Dad brought out the pie. I watched as he cut the pie into 8 thick slices. Dad, I said, it sure is nice having a new friend in the neighborhood. I was trying to get his attention, trying to tell him that Jeremy Ross was no longer my enemy, but Dad only smiled and nodded. I think he thought I was just pretending. Dad dished up 3 plates side by side with big pieces of pie and giant scoops of ice cream. Yum. He passed one to me and one to Jeremy. Wow, Jeremy said, looking at the pie. My dad never makes pies like this. It was at this point I started to panic. I didn't want Jeremy to eat the pie. He was my friend. I couldn't let him eat it. Jeremy, don't eat it. It's a bad pie. It's poisonous or something. Jeremy's fork stopped before it reached his mouth. He crumbled his eyebrows and he looked at me funny. I felt relieved. I had saved his life. I was a hero, so he didn't eat the enemy pie. Well, if it's so bad, Jeremy asked, why is your dad already eaten half of it? I turned to look at my dad. Sure enough, he was eating the enemy pie. Good stuff, he mumbled through a mouthful. And that was all he said. I sat there watching him eat enemy pie for a few seconds. Dad was laughing. Jeremy was happily eating, and neither of them were losing any hair. It seemed safe enough, so I took a tiny taste. Enemy pie was delicious. After dessert, Jeremy rode his bike home, but not before inviting me over to play on his trampoline in the morning. He said he'd even teach me how to flip. As for enemy pie, I still don't know how to make it, and I actually still wonder if enemies really do hate it, or if their hair falls out, or if their breath turns bad. But I don't know if I'll ever get that answer because I just lost my best enemy. There's the back cover. I think that's the AR code if you want to take an AR test. The end. All right, so that was a good story about friendship. And so I hope you liked it. Again, that's one of my favorite books. And some of you have probably heard it in guidance class. Some of the younger kids, it's probably the first time hearing it. We actually, I believe, have it in our library here as well, or I have it in my room. And thanks for watching, and hope you enjoy your evening. And we'll see you tomorrow, Valley Bulldogs. Bye.